Rain lashed across the darkened valley as lightning tore through the night sky, illuminating the terror in Lillian Harper's eyes. The old wooden bridge beneath her feet groaned and splintered, timbers cracking like gunshots over the roaring waters of the Snake River. It was 1882 in Wallace, Idaho, and Lillian was about to die until a strong hand seized her wrist as the final board gave way, and she found herself staring into the storm-gray eyes of a stranger. "I've got you, madam," the cowboy shouted over the thunder, his grip unyielding as her body dangled precariously over the churning river below. "Don't let go." Lillian had never planned to die this way, 23 years old, and suspended over raging waters in a territory that had promised new beginnings, but delivered only hardship. As the stranger's muscled arm strained to pull her to safety, she made a silent promise that if she survived this night, she would never take another sunrise for granted. The year had begun with such hope when Lillian left behind the comforts of Boston society, seeking adventure in the untamed West. Her father's passing had left her with enough inheritance to start fresh, and the booming mining town of Wallace had seemed like the perfect place to establish the small dress shop she'd always dreamed of opening. The newspaper advertisements had painted Idaho Territory as a land of opportunity, conveniently omitting the harsh realities that awaited independent women in mining towns. For months, she'd worked tirelessly to build her small business, ignoring the whispers that followed her through town. An unmarried woman with no family to speak of was an oddity in these parts. The townsfolk had been civil but distant, and on this stormy night, she'd been returning from delivering a mended dress to the mayor's wife when the bridge, the only direct path between her modest cabin and town, had begun to give way. "Hold tight." The cowboy called again, his face contorted with effort as he began to haul her upward. Lillian could see now that he was stretched out on his stomach at the edge of what remained of the bridge's entrance, his other hand gripping a support beam as he pulled her towards safety with remarkable strength. When he finally dragged her onto solid ground, they both collapsed in the mud, rain pelting their exhausted bodies. Lillian gasped for breath, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs as she turned to face her rescuer. "Thank you," she managed between ragged breaths. "I thought I was—" "No need for thanks, madam," he interrupted, rising to his feet and offering her his hand. "Name's Jackson Morgan. Most folks call me Jack. We'd best get out of this weather before the rest of this bridge decides to join the river." Jackson Morgan stood over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a lean, muscular build that spoke of years of hard work. His face bore the weathered lines of a man who'd spent most of his life under the open sky, yet couldn't have been more than 30 years old. Dark hair plastered to his forehead by the rain, and those remarkable gray eyes assessed her with concern. "Lillian Harper," she replied, accepting his hand and wincing as pain shot through her ankle. "I own the dress shop in town. Appears you've hurt yourself, Miss Harper." Without hesitation, he scooped her into his arms. "My horse is tethered just up the road. I'll get you to the doctor." "No," Lillian protested, embarrassment coloring her cheeks despite their dire circumstances. "My cabin is just across the meadow there. It's closer than town, and I can tend to it myself." Jackson studied her face for a moment before nodding. "As you wish, but I'll be escorting you all the same." Her weight seemed insignificant to him as he carried her through the downpour, his stride steady despite the treacherous mud. His horse, a magnificent Palomino, nickered softly as they approached. In one fluid motion, Jackson lifted Lillian onto the saddle before mounting behind her, one strong arm securing her against his chest. "Hold on," he instructed, his breath warm against her ear as they set off toward her cabin. The journey was mercifully short, but by the time they arrived, Lillian was trembling uncontrollably from cold and shock. Her small cabin appeared through the curtain of rain, and Jackson dismounted with surprising grace before helping her down. "You have a key?" he asked as they reached the door. Lillian fumbled in her sodden pocket, producing a small brass key. "Here." Inside, the cabin was dark and cold, the fire having died hours earlier. Jackson wasted no time, setting Lillian gently in a chair before moving to rekindle the hearth. His efficiency spoke of a man accustomed to survival in harsh conditions, and within minutes, flames licked eagerly at fresh kindling. "You need dry clothes," he stated matter-of-factly, turning to face her with firelight dancing across his features. "And that ankle needs looking at." Lillian nodded, suddenly aware of how her drenched dress clung to her frame. "There are blankets in the chest by the bed. I can manage the rest if you'll just." She gestured vaguely toward the door. A hint of a smile touched Jackson's lips. "I'll wait outside with the horse until you're decent." True to his word, he stepped out into the storm, closing the door firmly behind him. Lillian moved as quickly as her injured ankle would allow, peeling off her ruined dress and undergarments before wrapping herself in her warmest nightgown and woolen robe. She had just settled back into the chair with a blanket over her legs when a knock came at the door. "Come in," she called, suddenly self-conscious about her unbound hair falling loose around her shoulders. Jackson entered, water streaming from his duster. Without a word, he hung it by the door and removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her ankle. Lillian hesitated but then nodded. She'd lived independently for too long to be overly concerned with propriety, especially after this man had just saved her life. Jackson knelt before her, his touch gentle as he examined her swollen ankle. "Not broken," he pronounced after careful inspection. "A bad sprain, though. You ought to stay off it for a few days." "That's not possible," Lillian replied with a sigh. "I have orders to complete, and with the bridge gone." "The bridge being out is precisely why you need to rest that ankle," Jackson countered. "You won't be getting to town easily for a while." For the first time, the full implications of the collapsed bridge struck Lillian. The bridge had been the most direct route to town. Without it, she would need to take the long way around a journey of several miles rather than a short walk. "I don't believe I've seen you in Wallace before, Mr. Morgan," Lillian said, changing the subject as she studied his face in the firelight. "Just passing through," he replied, standing to move toward the fire. "I've been driving cattle up from Montana. Stopped in Wallace to resupply before heading to the coast." "A cattle drive in this weather?" Lillian raised an eyebrow skeptically. Jackson's laugh was unexpectedly warm. "No, madam. The drive ended 2 weeks ago in Coeur d'Alene. I'm on my own now, heading west to see about some land near Olympia." "Washington Territory," Lillian nodded. "I hear it's beautiful, so they say." Jackson stoked the fire, adding another log. "What brings a Boston lady to the Idaho wilderness? Your accent gives you away." Lillian smiled, surprised he'd picked up on her origins. "Opportunity, independence, the chance to build something that's entirely my own." Jackson nodded as though he understood completely. "Freedom has its price out here." "As I discovered tonight," Lillian agreed solemnly. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling fire and the persistent drumming of rain on the roof. Lillian found herself studying her unexpected guest, the way firelight highlighted the strong line of his jaw, the careful way he tended the fire, the weathered hands that had pulled her from certain death. "You should try to sleep," Jackson finally said. "The storm's not letting up any time soon, and you've had quite a shock." "Where will you go?" Lillian asked, suddenly concerned about sending him back into the tempest. "I'll make do in your lean-to with my horse," he replied with a shrug. "I've slept in worse conditions." "Nonsense," Lillian heard herself say before she could reconsider. "You saved my life, Mr. Morgan. The least I can offer is shelter from the storm. You can sleep by the fire." Jackson's eyes met hers, assessing. "That wouldn't be proper, Miss Harper." "Proper?" Lillian couldn't help but laugh. "I'm a woman living alone in mining country, running my own business. I believe propriety and I parted ways some time ago." A slow smile spread across Jackson's face, transforming his weather-beaten features into something quite handsome. "If you're certain—" "I am," she confirmed. "There are extra blankets in the chest. Make yourself comfortable." As Lillian hobbled to her bed in the corner of the single-room cabin, she wondered at her own boldness. Never before had she invited a man to stay the night, yet something about Jackson Morgan inspired trust. Perhaps it was the way he'd risked his own life to save hers. Or perhaps it was simply the honest integrity she sensed in him. Whatever the reason, as she drifted to sleep to the sound of rain and the occasional soft movements of her guest tending the fire, Lillian felt safer than she had since arriving in Wallace. Morning arrived with gentle persistence, sunlight streaming through the cabin's small windows and illuminating motes of dust, dancing in golden beams. Lillian awoke to the unfamiliar but enticing aroma of coffee and something cooking. For a moment, disorientation clouded her mind until the events of the previous night came rushing back. She opened her eyes to find Jackson Morgan moving quietly around her small kitchen area, his back to her as he tended something in a pan over the wood stove. He'd removed his outer shirt, working in just his undershirt, suspenders, and trousers, offering Lillian an unimpeded view of his broad shoulders and strong back. "Good morning," she said, her voice still rough with sleep. Jackson turned, spatula in hand, and offered a smile that sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. "Morning, Miss Harper. Hope you don't mind, but I found some eggs and bacon in your cold box. Figured you could use a hot meal after last night's ordeal." Lillian pushed herself up, wincing as pain shot through her ankle. "Not at all, that's very kind of you." "How's the ankle?" Jackson asked, his eyes dropping to her blanket-covered legs. "Painful," she admitted, "but I'm sure it will improve with time." Jackson nodded, returning to his cooking. "I checked on the bridge at first light. What's left of it won't be passable for some time. Town's effectively cut off from this side of the river unless you're willing to ride 5 miles upstream to the crossing at Wilson's Ford." The news settled heavily on Lillian's shoulders. Her business relied on accessibility, and with the bridge gone, her already precarious financial situation would surely worsen. "Here," Jackson said, interrupting her troubled thoughts as he handed her a plate of perfectly cooked eggs and bacon. "Eat while it's hot." The food was delicious, prepared with a skill that surprised her. As they ate in comfortable silence, Lillian found herself studying Jackson when he wasn't looking. In daylight, she could see details that had been obscured by darkness and a small scar that cut through his right eyebrow. The way his hair curled slightly at his temples. The faint laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than his serious demeanor implied. "You cook well for a cowboy," Lillian remarked when she'd finished her meal. Jackson chuckled, collecting her empty plate. "When you've spent as many years on cattle drives as I have, you either learn to cook or resign yourself to eating burned beans for months on end." "How long have you been driving cattle?" she asked, genuinely curious about this man who'd appeared from nowhere to save her life. "Since I was 16, he replied, washing their plates in the basin. "Started as a wrangler, worked my way up to trail boss by 25. "And now you're heading to Washington to buy land." Lillian pressed, intrigued by the shift in his fortunes. Jackson nodded, drying his hands on a towel. My uncle passed last year, left me a modest inheritance. Not enough to live like a king, but enough to buy a decent piece of land and some starter stock. You're going to start your own ranch, Lillian deduced. That's the plan, he confirmed, a hint of pride in his voice. I've spent enough years working other men's cattle. Time to build something of my own. His words echoed her own reasons for coming to Wallace, and Lillian felt a surprising kinship with this stranger. Both of them were seeking independence, the chance to create something lasting. Miss Harper, Jackson began, his tone shifting to something more serious. I don't feel right leaving you here alone with that ankle and the bridge out. Is there someone in town who might come check on you, a friend or a husband? Lillian finished for him with a wry smile. No, Mr. Morgan. I'm quite alone here by choice, and while I appreciate your concern, I've managed on my own for some time now. Jackson frowned, clearly unconvinced. At least let me ride into town and inform the sheriff about the bridge. He should know, and he might send someone to help you until you can manage that ankle properly. Lillian wanted to refuse. Her independence was precious to her, but practicality won out. That would be kind of you, Mr. Morgan. While you're there, could you inform Mrs. Hollister at the general store that I won't be able to deliver her daughter's dress this week? She's expecting it for the spring dance. Of course, Jackson agreed, already reaching for his duster. Is there anything else you need from town? Lillian hesitated, reluctant to ask more of this man who had already done so much. Perhaps some more coffee. I'm afraid we've depleted my supply this morning. Jackson's smile was warm. Coffee it is. I'll return before sundown. As he prepared to leave, Lillian felt a strange reluctance to see him go. It had been months since she'd enjoyed conversation over breakfast, longer still since she'd felt the curious comfort of another person moving about her space. Mr. Morgan, she called as he reached for the door. Thank you, not just for last night but for all of this. Jackson turned, his gray eyes meeting hers with unexpected intensity. You're welcome, Miss Harper. Lock the door behind me. With that, he was gone, and Lillian found herself listening to the receding hoofbeats of his horse, already counting the hours until his return. The day passed slowly as Lillian attempted to occupy herself within the confines of her small cabin. She managed to hobble to her workbench, where she continued stitching the elaborate beadwork on Mrs. Hollister's daughter's dress, though she knew now it would be late. The work was delicate and required concentration, which helped keep her mind from wandering too often to thoughts of Jackson Morgan. By mid-afternoon, however, restlessness had set in. Using a sturdy branch as a makeshift crutch, Lillian made her way outside to assess the damage from the storm. The air was fresh and clean, with that peculiar brightness that often follows heavy rain. Birds sang enthusiastically in the surrounding pines, and if not for the collapsed bridge visible in the distance, one might never know the violence of the previous night's tempest. Her small garden had survived mostly intact, though some of her young pea plants had been flattened by the downpour. Lillian was carefully attempting to stake them upright when the sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. Jackson appeared around the bend in the road, his palomino trotting at an easy pace. Behind him, to Lillian's surprise, was a wagon driven by Sheriff Martin Davis. Miss Harper. The sheriff called as they approached. Looks like you had quite the adventure last night. Lillian straightened, leaning heavily on her makeshift crutch. Good afternoon, Sheriff. Yes, it was rather more excitement than I generally prefer. Jackson dismounted in one fluid motion, immediately moving to her side. You shouldn't be out here on that ankle, he admonished softly, his hand instinctively supporting her elbow. I was going stir-crazy inside, she admitted, oddly pleased by his concern. Sheriff Davis pulled his wagon to a stop and climbed down, his perpetually ruddy face serious for once. "Mr. Morgan here rode into town with quite the tale. Says he pulled you from certain death just as the bridge gave way." "He did," Lillian confirmed, glancing at Jackson with gratitude. "I would have been swept away if not for his quick action." The sheriff nodded, his bushy mustache twitching. "Well, the town council's already meeting about rebuilding the bridge. Can't have folks cut off like this. In the meantime, I've brought you some supplies." He gestured to the wagon, which Lillian could now see was loaded with various goods. "Courtesy of the merchants in town. They're concerned about you out here alone." Lillian was touched by the gesture. While she'd always kept to herself, it seemed the townsfolk had noticed her absence more than she'd realized. "That's very kind," she said sincerely. "Please convey my thanks." "Mr. Morgan also mentioned your injured ankle," the sheriff continued, eyeing her makeshift crutch with disapproval. "Doc Sullivan sent these." He reached into his pocket and produced a small packet. "Willow bark powder for the pain and swelling. Says to steep it in hot water and drink it 3 times daily." "Thank you," Lillian said, accepting the packet. "Now, Miss Harper," Sheriff Davis began, his tone shifting to something more official. "I don't feel right leaving you out here alone with that injury and the bridge out. Town's a good 5 miles by the alternate route, too far if you need help." Lillian opened her mouth to protest, but the sheriff continued. "Mr. Morgan here has offered to stay on a few days, help you out until you're mobile again, or until we get that bridge rebuilt. I told him you're a proper lady who might object to such an arrangement, but he assures me he'll make camp outside to maintain proprieties." Heat crept up Lillian's neck as she glanced at Jackson, who was studiously avoiding her gaze. "That's not necessary," she began. "With all due respect, Miss Harper," Jackson interrupted, finally meeting her eyes, "it is necessary. You can barely walk and you're isolated out here. I'm heading west anyway, and a few days' delay won't matter in the grand scheme." There was something in his expression, a mixture of concern and something else she couldn't quite identify, that made arguing seem futile. Besides, a small, traitorous part of her was glad for the excuse to have him stay. "Very well," she conceded, trying to sound reluctant. "If you insist, Mr. Morgan." Sheriff Davis looked relieved. "Excellent. Now let's get these supplies inside before I head back to town." Between the two men, the wagon was quickly unloaded. Lillian was astonished by the generosity of the town merchants' flour, sugar, coffee, salt pork, dried beans, even a small crock of fresh butter from the Wilkinsons' dairy. Mrs. Hollister had sent fabric and notions, apparently understanding that Lillian would continue working despite her circumstances. There were even medicines from Dr. Sullivan and books from the town's small lending library. "I had no idea people would be so concerned," Lillian remarked as Jackson arranged the last of the supplies on her shelves. "Folks look out for each other out here," Sheriff Davis replied matter-of-factly. "It's the Western way. You may keep to yourself, Miss Harper, but you're still one of ours." The simple statement affected Lillian more than she expected. Since her arrival in Wallace, she'd maintained a certain distance from the townspeople, assuming they viewed her with suspicion or disinterest. To discover they considered her one of theirs was unexpectedly moving. After the sheriff departed with assurances that he would check back in a few days, Lillian found herself once again alone with Jackson Morgan. A strange awkwardness settled between them as they stood in her small cabin, surrounded by the generous offerings from town. "You didn't need to do this," Lillian finally said, breaking the silence. Jackson shrugged, seemingly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "It was the right thing to do." "You've already saved my life, Mr. Morgan. You owe me nothing more, Jack," he said, looking up from arranging firewood. "If I'm to be camping on your property for a few days, you might as well call me Jack." Lillian smiled despite herself. "Very well, Jack, and I suppose you should call me Lillian given the circumstances." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Lillian, then." The way he said her name with a gentle emphasis on the first syllable sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. To cover her reaction, Lillian moved to the stove, wincing as she put weight on her injured ankle. "I should prepare supper to thank you for all you've done," she said, reaching for the newly acquired provisions. "You'll do no such thing," Jack countered, gently but firmly guiding her to a chair. "You need to stay off that ankle. I'll handle supper." "But no arguments," he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for debate. "Consider it part of the service." Lillian found herself obeying, partly because the pain in her ankle was intensifying after her outdoor excursion, and partly because there was something irresistibly compelling about Jack's quiet authority. As he moved around her kitchen with surprising ease, Lillian took the opportunity to study him more carefully. He wasn't classically handsome like the gentlemen who had courted her in Boston, with their smooth hands and perfectly trimmed mustaches. Jack Morgan was rugged, his face weathered by sun and wind, his hands calloused from years of hard work. Yet there was a grace to his movements, a confidence that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin. "You're staring," Jack remarked without turning around, amusement evident in his voice. Lillian felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I was merely observing your cooking technique." His low chuckle told her he wasn't fooled, but he kindly didn't press the matter. Instead, he continued preparing a simple but hearty stew, adding ingredients with the assurance of someone who had cooked the dish many times before. "How did you learn to cook so well?" Lillian asked, genuinely curious. Jack glanced over his shoulder. "My mother died when I was young." "My father was not adept in the kitchen. It was either learn to cook or starve." The casual mention of his mother's death was delivered without self-pity, but Lillian sensed the old wound beneath the matter-of-fact words. "I'm sorry about your mother." Jack nodded his acknowledgement but didn't elaborate. "What about you? What brought you all the way from Boston to the wilds of Idaho?" Lillian hesitated, unaccustomed to sharing her personal history. But something about Jack, perhaps the fact that he had literally held her life in his hands, made her want to open up. "My father was a professor at Harvard," she began, fingering the edge of her apron. "He believed in education for women, much to the dismay of his colleagues. He taught me literature, mathematics, even some Latin and Greek." "An educated woman," Jack remarked, stirring the stew. "That explains a lot." "What does it explain?" Lillian asked, curious about his perception of her. "The books," he gestured toward her small but well-stocked bookshelf. "The way you speak. The fact that you're running your own business instead of seeking a husband." There was no judgment in his tone, merely observation, which Lillian found refreshing. Most men she'd encountered viewed her independence with suspicion or disapproval. "My father died last year," she continued, finding it surprisingly easy to talk to Jack as he worked. "He left me enough money to start over somewhere new. Boston held too many painful memories and too many expectations for a professor's daughter. I wanted to go somewhere my past wouldn't define me. So you chose one of the most remote mining towns in Idaho Territory," Jack finished for her, a hint of admiration in his voice. "The advertisement made it sound quite civilized," Lillian admitted with a small laugh. "I didn't realize booming industry meant muddy streets filled with prospectors and developing community meant 3 saloons for every church." Jack laughed, the sound rich and genuine. The newspapers do tend to embellish when they're trying to attract settlers, especially women. Men will follow where the women go. Well, they neglected to mention the collapsed bridges and flash floods as well, Lillian added wryly. To be fair, I've been traveling through these parts for years, and I've never seen a storm like last night's, Jack said, ladling the fragrant stew into 2 bowls. You were just remarkably unlucky or lucky, depending on how you look at it. Lucky? Lillian questioned as he placed a bowl before her. Jack's eyes met hers, unexpectedly intense. You survived, and… He hesitated, a hint of color touching his tanned cheeks. I got to meet you. The simple statement hung in the air between them, charged with meaning that neither was ready to acknowledge. Lillian dropped her gaze to her stew, her heart beating a little faster than normal. This looks delicious, she said, deliberately changing the subject. Jack accepted the deflection gracefully, settling into the chair across from her with his own bowl. It's just a simple trail stew, but it'll fill your belly. The meal was indeed delicious, and conversation flowed more easily as they ate. Jack told her stories of cattle drives across Montana and Wyoming, of sleeping under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, of the camaraderie between cowboys who depended on each other for survival. Lillian shared tales of Boston society, of the scandalous poems she would read in secret, of her dreams to someday see the grand cities of Europe. As darkness fell, Jack rose to light the lamps and stoke the fire. I should set up my camp before it gets too late, he said, reaching for his duster. You don't have to sleep outside, Lillian found herself saying before she could reconsider. The weather's still cool and there's plenty of room by the fire. Jack paused, studying her face carefully. That's not proper, Lillian. You know that as well as I do. Propriety seems a small concern when you've already saved my life, she countered, meeting his gaze steadily. Besides, who's to know out here? A slow smile spread across Jack's face, transforming his features. You're not like any woman I've ever met, Lillian Harper. I'll take that as a compliment, she replied, returning his smile. It was meant as one. Jack hung his duster back on the peg by the door, but I'll sleep by the door just the same. As Lillian prepared for bed that night, moving gingerly on her injured ankle, she was acutely aware of Jack's presence in her small cabin. She should have felt uncomfortable having a virtual stranger in her home, yet somehow it felt right. There was a security in his presence, a comfort that went beyond the practical assistance he provided. From her bed, she watched as he spread his bedroll near the door, removed his boots and stretched out, one arm behind his head as he stared at the ceiling. "Good night, Jack," she said softly, blowing out her lamp in the dimness. Illuminated only by the dying fire, she saw him turn his head toward her. "Good night, Lillian. Sleep well." As she drifted toward sleep, Lillian realized that for the first time since arriving in Wallace, she felt completely at ease. It was an unexpected gift, this sense of security and companionship, delivered by a storm that had nearly claimed her life. The irony wasn't lost on her, as she slipped into dreams filled with gray eyes and strong hands that refused to let her fall. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the spring sun warming the small cabin and casting patterns of light across the wooden floor. Lillian awoke to find Jack already up and about, stoking the fire and putting coffee on to boil. He moved quietly, clearly trying not to disturb her sleep, and the consideration touched her. "Good morning," she said, pushing herself up against her pillows. Jack turned, a smile warming his features when he saw she was awake. "Morning. How's the ankle?" Lillian experimentally flexed her foot, wincing slightly. "Better, I think. Still sore, but the swelling seems reduced." "The willow bark tea probably helped," Jack nodded approvingly. You should have another dose with breakfast." As he turned back to the stove, Lillian took the opportunity to observe him unnoticed. In the morning light, with his guard down, Jack looked younger, the hard lines of his face softened. He'd rolled his sleeves to his elbows, revealing tanned, muscular forearms dusted with dark hair. There was an easy confidence to his movements, a man comfortable with physical labor and the simple tasks of daily living. When he approached with a steaming cup of the medicinal tea, Lillian quickly averted her gaze, not wanting to be caught staring again. "Drink this while I finish breakfast," he instructed, handing her the cup. "Doc Sullivan says it works best on an empty stomach." The tea was bitter, but Lillian dutifully drank it all, knowing the medicine would help her heal faster. By the time she finished, Jack had prepared a simple but hearty breakfast of cornmeal mush with a drizzle of molasses. "I need to check on my horse and bring in more firewood," Jack said as they ate. "Is there anything you need done while I'm outside?" Lillian considered the question. "If you wouldn't mind checking my garden. I was trying to salvage some of the plants yesterday when you returned with the sheriff." Jack nodded. "I can do that. Anything else?" "Actually," Lillian hesitated, "if it's not too much trouble, I'd like to see the bridge or what's left of it, just to understand what we're dealing with." Jack frowned slightly. "You shouldn't be walking on that ankle yet." "I know," Lillian agreed. "But perhaps you could help me, just to look. I won't try to cross or anything foolish." He studied her for a moment, seemingly weighing her request. "All right," he finally conceded. "But we'll wait until afternoon when it's warmer, and you'll use me for support instead of that makeshift crutch." Lillian smiled, pleased with the compromise. "Thank you, Jack." After breakfast, Jack headed outside to tend to his chores while Lillian set herself up at her workbench. Despite her injury, she was determined to make progress on the dance dress. The beadwork was intricate, requiring careful attention, and she lost herself in the rhythm of the tiny stitches. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear Jack return until his shadow fell across her table. "That's beautiful," he said, examining the elaborate pattern of beads she was creating along the bodice of the pale blue dress. Lillian looked up, surprised to find him watching her with genuine interest. "Thank you. It's for Abigail Hollister, her first real dance as a young lady." "You have a gift," Jack commented, tracing the pattern with his finger without touching the delicate work. "Where did you learn to do this?" "My mother before she passed," Lillian replied, setting her needle down. "She believed a lady should be accomplished in the domestic arts, even while my father was teaching me mathematics." "They sound like remarkable parents," Jack said softly. "They were," Lillian agreed, a familiar ache of loss blooming in her chest. "Different in many ways, but united in their belief that I should have choices in life." Jack nodded thoughtfully. "A rare perspective, especially for a girl." "What about your parents?" Lillian asked, realizing how little she knew about this man who had so dramatically entered her life. "You mentioned your mother died young." A shadow passed across Jack's face. "She did. Fever took her when I was 8. My father was a rancher in Colorado, tough man, fair but not particularly demonstrative. He taught me the value of hard work and keeping my word." "Is he still in Colorado?" Lillian inquired gently. Jack shook his head. "Past 5 years ago. Heart gave out while he was mending fences. Foreman found him at sundown, still holding his tools." The matter-of-fact way he delivered this information didn't quite mask the loss beneath. Lillian instinctively reached out, placing her hand over his where it rested on the table. "I'm sorry, Jack." He turned his hand over, briefly squeezing her fingers before releasing them. "It's the way of things out here. You learn to move forward." The moment hung between them, a shared understanding of grief and resilience. Then Jack straightened, deliberately lightening his tone. Your garden is salvageable. I've staked the plants that were knocked down and the rest seem to be thriving after the rain. Thank you, Lillian said, allowing him to change the subject. I'm not much of a gardener yet, but I'm learning. It's a good garden for a beginner, Jack assured her. Come fall, you'll have plenty of vegetables if you keep at it. The thought that she would still be here come fall, tending her garden alone after Jack had moved on to Washington territory, brought an unexpected pang. Lillian pushed the feeling aside, reminding herself that Jack Morgan was merely passing through her life, a momentary intersection of two separate journeys. Are you ready to see the bridge? Jack asked, interrupting her thoughts. The sun's high now, and it's warmed up nicely outside. Lillian nodded, setting aside her sewing. Yes, I'd like that. With Jack's strong arm around her waist for support, Lillian made her way slowly down the path toward the river. The day was indeed beautiful, with clear blue skies and the fresh scent of pine carried on a gentle breeze. Birds called from the trees, and wildflowers dotted the meadow on either side of the path. It's hard to believe there was such a violent storm just 2 nights ago, Lillian remarked as they walked. Nature has a way of healing itself quickly, Jack replied. Unlike people, who sometimes carry their storms long after the skies have cleared. The philosophical observation surprised Lillian, revealing a depth to Jack she hadn't fully appreciated. That's rather poetic for a cowboy, she teased gently. Jack's mouth quirked in a half-smile. Even cowboys have thoughts beyond cattle and horses, Miss Harper. I didn't mean to imply otherwise, Lillian hastily apologized, concerned she'd offended him. Jack's arm tightened slightly around her waist in reassurance. I know. I'm just saying there's more to most people than what shows on the surface. As they rounded the final bend in the path, the remains of the bridge came into view, and Lillian gasped softly. What had once been a solid wooden structure spanning the river was now a twisted wreckage of timber. Only the stone supports on either bank remained intact, with a few broken planks hanging precariously between them. The river below, still swollen from the storm, rushed by with intimidating force. It's worse than I imagined, Lillian murmured, unconsciously leaning more heavily against Jack. The sheriff says they'll start rebuilding next week, Jack informed her, his solid presence comforting beside her. But it will take at least a month, maybe longer if the river doesn't recede soon. The reality of her isolation struck Lillian anew. A month without direct access to town meant a month without new customers, without regular income. Her carefully managed finances would be strained to the breaking point. A month, she repeated softly, anxiety creeping into her voice despite her efforts to remain calm. Jack turned to face her, his hands gently gripping her upper arms. Hey, he said, ducking his head slightly to meet her eyes. You'll be all right. The town won't forget about you. It's not that, Lillian admitted, finding it difficult to maintain her usual composure under his direct gaze. It's my business. I've been barely making ends meet as it is, a month without regular customers. She trailed off, not wanting to reveal the full precariousness of her financial situation. Understanding dawned in Jack's eyes. You're sewing. You need the income. Lillian nodded, embarrassed by her vulnerability. I have some savings, but not enough to weather a month without work. Jack was quiet for a moment, his thumbs absently rubbing small circles on her arms as he thought. What if the customers came to you instead? He finally suggested. What do you mean? Once your ankle is better, I could take you to Wilson's Ford and into town once a week, Jack explained. You could collect orders, deliver completed work, and get supplies. In between, customers who really need your services could make the ride around. But you're heading to Washington, Lillian reminded him, trying to ignore the leap of hope his words had inspired. You can't delay your plans for a month just to help me. Jack's expression was unreadable as he studied her face. Maybe I can, he said quietly. Maybe I want to. The simple statement sent Lillian's heart racing. She searched his eyes, looking for signs that she had misinterpreted his meaning, but found only sincere regard looking back at her. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack's gaze dropped briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes. "Because I've never met anyone quite like you, Lillian Harper, and because sometimes life puts people in our path for a reason." The intensity of the moment was almost overwhelming. Standing there at the edge of the broken bridge, supported by this man who had already saved her life once, Lillian felt as though she stood at a different kind of threshold, one that had nothing to do with crossing rivers, and everything to do with crossing boundaries she'd carefully maintained around her heart. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the spell between them. Jack stepped back slightly, though he kept a supportive arm around her waist, as they turned to see who was approaching from the town side of the river. Sheriff Davis appeared on horseback, accompanied by two men Lillian recognized as members of the town council. They reined in their horses at the edge of the broken bridge, calling across the gap, "Miss Harper, Mr. Morgan, glad to see you're both well." The sheriff shouted over the rush of the water. "We're managing, Sheriff," Jack called back. "What brings you out this way again so soon?" "Town council's been discussing the bridge situation," the sheriff replied. "Wanted to survey the damage ourselves." Mr. Prescott here has some experience with bridge building. The older of the two councilmen, Arthur Prescott, owner of the lumber mill, nodded in greeting. "Miss Harper, we're concerned about your situation. The bridge will take at least 4 weeks to rebuild, maybe longer." "So I've been told," Lillian responded, raising her voice to be heard across the gap. "We've had a proposal from several ladies in town," Sheriff Davis continued. "They've suggested you might want to relocate temporarily to town, stay with one of the families until the bridge is repaired. Mrs. Sullivan, the doctor's wife, has offered her spare room." The offer was generous and practical. Lillian should have felt grateful. Instead, she felt an inexplicable reluctance at the thought of leaving her cabin and Jack. "That's very kind," she called back, aware of Jack's arm tensing slightly around her waist. "But I have my business set up here, my garden to tend. I think I'll stay, at least for now." The sheriff exchanged glances with the councilman. "Are you certain, Miss Harper?" "It's a long way around if you need anything." "I'm certain," Lillian confirmed. "Mr. Morgan has kindly offered to help me until my ankle heals and to take me to town when necessary." At this, the three men across the river studied Jack with newfound interest. Lillian could almost see the questions forming in their minds about the nature of her relationship with the cowboy. "I see," the sheriff finally said, his tone careful. "Well, if you change your mind, the offer stands. We'll be starting on the bridge next Monday. In the meantime, if you need anything, send word with anyone heading to town." After a few more exchanges about the bridge reconstruction plans, the three men departed, leaving Jack and Lillian once again alone by the riverside. "You didn't have to turn down their offer on my account," Jack said quietly once the men were out of earshot. Lillian turned to face him, still supported by his arm. "I didn't. I meant what I said. My business is here. My home is here. I've never been one to impose on others' charity if I can avoid it." Jack studied her face, seeming to search for something in her expression. Whatever he found must have satisfied him, because he nodded slowly. "Independent to a fault," he murmured, a hint of admiration in his voice. "Says the man who's driving cattle and building ranches on his own," Lillian countered with a small smile. Jack laughed, the tension of the moment breaking. "Fair point. It seems we're well matched in stubbornness, at least." "Well matched," Lillian repeated softly, the phrase lingering between them with unspoken possibilities. Jack cleared his throat, suddenly seeming aware of how close they were standing. "We should head back. You've been on your feet long enough for one day." As they made their way back to the cabin, Lillian found herself hyper-aware of Jack's arm around her waist, the solid warmth of his body against her side. Something had shifted between them at the bridge, a recognition of feelings that had been developing since that first night in the storm. What those feelings meant, and where they might lead, remained to be seen. But as Jack helped her up the steps to her cabin door, his hand steady and strong beneath her elbow, Lillian knew with sudden clarity that her life had irreversibly changed the moment the bridge collapsed beneath her feet. Days passed with unexpected swiftness as Lillian and Jack settled into a comfortable routine. Each morning, Jack would rise before dawn to tend to his horse and bring in fresh water and firewood before preparing breakfast. Lillian would join him as the sun rose, and they would share the meal amid easy conversation that grew more personal with each passing day. During the days, Lillian continued her sewing work, making remarkable progress on Abigail Hollister's dance dress, as well as several other orders that had been in progress before the bridge collapsed. Jack kept himself busy with repairs around the cabin that Lillian had been unable to address on her own: a leaking corner of the roof, loose boards on the porch steps, a window that wouldn't properly close. His capable hands transformed the small homestead, making improvements that Lillian, with her limited experience in such matters, hadn't even known to attempt. In the evenings, they would share supper before settling by the fire. Sometimes they would read. Lillian had been surprised and pleased to discover Jack's fondness for literature, particularly adventure tales and poetry. Other nights, they would simply talk, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for their futures. Occasionally, Jack would take out a small harmonica and play soft, melancholy tunes that filled the cabin with an intimate warmth. By the end of the first week, Lillian's ankle had improved enough that she could move about the cabin without assistance, though she still used a proper crutch Jack had fashioned for her when venturing outside. The physical closeness necessitated by her injury in those first days had established a comfort between them that remained even as she regained her independence. It was on the 8th day of their unexpected cohabitation that Jack announced it was time for Lillian to make her first trip to town. "Your ankle's strong enough if we're careful," he said over breakfast. "And you mentioned needing more thread for the Hollister dress. Besides, it would do you good to get out for a while." Lillian nodded, secretly pleased at the prospect of an excursion after days confined to the cabin and its immediate surroundings. "How will we manage it? I can't ride your horse all the way to Wilson's Ford." "Already solved," Jack replied with a hint of pride. "Sheriff Davis brought over the widow Peterson's old buggy yesterday while you were napping. It's not fancy, but it'll get us to town and back comfortably enough." Lillian felt a rush of gratitude for this man who continued to anticipate her needs before she voiced them. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" Jack's smile was warm. "I try. We'll leave after breakfast, spend a few hours in town, and be back before dark." The journey to Wilson's Ford took nearly an hour by buggy, with Jack handling the reins and Lillian seated beside him on the narrow bench. The day was pleasantly warm, the countryside vibrant with late spring growth, and despite the roughness of the road, Lillian found herself enjoying the outing immensely. "I never realized how beautiful this area is," she remarked as they crested a hill that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. "I've been so focused on my work and just surviving that I haven't taken time to truly see it." Jack glanced at her, a thoughtful expression on his face. That happens to a lot of folks out here. The daily struggle for survival blinds them to the beauty all around. It's one of the reasons I've stayed out west. Despite the hardships, there's a majesty to this land that seeps into your bones if you let it. Lillian studied his profile as he spoke, struck by how at home he looked against the backdrop of mountains and sky. "You really love it here, don't you?" "I do," he admitted, his eyes scanning the horizon. "The cities back east always felt like they were closing in on me the few times I visited. Out here a man can breathe, can think." "And a woman?" Lillian asked softly. "Is there room for women to breathe and think in your West, Jack Morgan?" He turned to her then, his gray eyes serious. "The right kind of woman, absolutely. The West needs women with courage and vision as much as it needs men. Maybe more so." The admiration in his voice was unmistakable, and Lillian felt a flush of pleasure at being counted among such women in his estimation. The moment held between them, filled with unspoken understanding, until the buggy hit a particularly rough patch of road, jolting them both back to practical concerns. Wilson's Ford proved to be little more than a sturdy bridge spanning a narrower section of the river, with a small trading post nearby. From there, the road to Wallace was better maintained, and they made good time into town. Lillian had not realized how much she'd missed human interaction until they arrived in Wallace. The streets were busy with the usual mix of miners, merchants, and townspeople going about their business. Heads turned as Jack helped her down from the buggy in front of Mrs. Hollister's general store, and Lillian was acutely aware of the curiosity in their gazes. News traveled fast in small towns, and everyone would have heard by now about the bridge collapse and Jack's heroic rescue. What they couldn't know, what Lillian herself was only beginning to understand, was how deeply their lives had become intertwined in the days since. "Lillian Harper, as I live and breathe," Mrs. Hollister exclaimed as they entered the store, hurrying from behind the counter to embrace her. "We've been so worried about you, dear." Lillian returned the embrace, surprised by the genuine concern in the older woman's voice. "I'm quite all right, Mrs. Hollister, thanks to Mr. Morgan here." Mrs. Hollister turned her attention to Jack, assessing him with the frank appraisal of a woman who had raised 5 children and buried 2 husbands. "Mr. Morgan, the town owes you a debt of gratitude for saving our Lillian." Jack removed his hat respectfully. "No debt necessary, madam. Anyone would have done the same." "I doubt that very much," Mrs. Hollister replied dryly. "Not many men would risk their lives for a stranger, nor stay on to help afterward." Her shrewd eyes moved between them, noting their easy familiarity with each other. "But come in, come in. Abigail will be thrilled to know you're working on her dress, despite everything." The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Word of Lillian's arrival in town spread quickly, and the general store soon became an impromptu gathering place as women came to check on her welfare, bring small gifts, and inquire about their sewing orders. To Lillian's surprise and gratification, not one customer complained about delays. Instead, they expressed concern for her situation and admiration for her determination to continue working despite the circumstances. Throughout it all, Jack remained by her side, a steady, reassuring presence. He said little, content to let Lillian manage her business affairs, but his attentiveness didn't go unnoticed by the townswomen, who exchanged knowing glances and whispered comments behind their hands. By mid-afternoon, Lillian had collected several new orders, purchased necessary supplies, and arranged for future visits to town. Mrs. Hollister insisted they take tea and fresh baked cookies before departing, and it was during this respite that she broached the subject that had clearly been on her mind. "Mr. Morgan," she began, her tone conversational but her eyes sharp. "Sheriff Davis mentioned you're on your way to Washington Territory to start a ranch." Jack nodded, sipping his tea. "That's right, madam. I have some land picked out near Olympia. Fine country, I hear, Mrs. Hollister continued, though Idaho has its charms as well, particularly for a man looking to settle down. The implication was clear, and Lillian felt heat rising to her cheeks. "Mrs. Hollister," she began, intending to deflect the conversation. "Oh, I'm just making conversation, dear," the older woman interrupted with a wave of her hand. "Though I will say, Mr. Morgan, that Wallace could use more men of your caliber. Most of our menfolk are either confirmed bachelors or rough miners with few social graces." Jack met the woman's gaze steadily, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "I'll take that as a compliment, Mrs. Hollister, but my plans were set before I arrived here." "Plans change," Mrs. Hollister replied simply, refilling their teacups. "Life has a way of rearranging our carefully laid paths, often for the better." The conversation shifted to other topics, but the older woman's words lingered in the air between Lillian and Jack as they prepared to depart. As Jack loaded their purchases into the buggy, Sheriff Davis approached, his expression friendly but purposeful. "Miss Harper, Mr. Morgan," he greeted them. "Glad I caught you before you headed back. I wanted to let you know the bridge work is proceeding faster than expected. We might have it completed in 3 weeks rather than 4. "That's wonderful news, Sheriff," Lillian responded, though she felt an unexpected twinge of regret at the thought of returning to her solitary life sooner than anticipated. "Indeed it is," the sheriff agreed. "Though I hope, Mr. Morgan, that you won't be in too much of a rush to leave us once it's finished." Jack secured the last of their packages before turning to face the lawman. "My plans depend on a number of factors, Sheriff," Davis nodded sagely. Of course. Just know that Wallace would welcome a man with your skills should you decide to linger or even settle. We need good men here." As they departed town, Lillian was acutely aware that something had shifted during their visit. The townspeople had all but declared their approval of Jack, and by extension, of any attachment that might be forming between them. It was both flattering and mildly mortifying to be the subject of such transparent matchmaking efforts. "Well," she said as the town receded behind them, "that was certainly interesting." Jack chuckled, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Small towns. Everyone knows everyone's business, and feels entitled to direct it," Lillian added with a wry smile. "I apologize for Mrs. Hollister's forwardness." "And the sheriff's." Jack glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "No need to apologize. They care about you, that's clear enough." "They barely know me," Lillian protested. "I've kept to myself since arriving." "Sometimes people see more than we give them credit for," Jack replied simply. "They see a woman of courage and determination, making her way alone in difficult circumstances. They admire that, and they want to see you happy." The simple assessment touched Lillian deeply. "And you?" she asked, her voice softer. "What do you see, Jack Morgan?" He was quiet for so long that Lillian thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and earnest. "I see a woman unlike any I've ever known. A woman who makes me question the path I thought was set before me." The confession hung in the air between them, profound in its simplicity and honesty. Lillian's heart beat faster, but before she could respond, Jack continued. "But I also see that we've known each other barely 2 weeks, that emotions run high in unusual circumstances. That decisions made in haste often lead to regret." His caution was reasonable, even admirable, yet Lillian couldn't help feeling disappointed. "You're right, of course," she said, striving to keep her tone light. "It would be foolish to read too much into a situation born of emergency and necessity." Jack's hands tightened on the reins. "That's not what I meant, Lillian. I'm not dismissing what's growing between us. I'm simply saying that important decisions deserve proper time and consideration." The clarification eased some of the tightness in Lillian's chest. "So what are you saying, exactly?" Jack guided the buggy around a bend in the road before answering. "I'm saying that I'd like to stay on until the bridge is repaired, regardless of when that happens. I'd like to see where this path leads us, without the pressure of town gossip or rushed decisions." It was a measured, thoughtful response, exactly what she should have expected from a man like Jack Morgan, who considered his words and actions carefully. Lillian found herself smiling, a warm contentment spreading through her. "I'd like that too," she replied simply. The journey back to her cabin was filled with comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts yet acutely aware of the other's presence. As they crossed Wilson's Ford and headed toward the familiar path home, Lillian realized with sudden clarity that she'd begun thinking of her cabin as home in a deeper sense since Jack's arrival. What had been merely shelter before had become something more, a place of warmth, companionship, and possibility. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. For a woman who had prided herself on self-reliance, acknowledging that her happiness now included another person was a significant shift. Yet as she glanced at Jack's profile against the setting sun, Lillian couldn't bring herself to regret the change. Whatever path lay ahead, they would walk it together, at least for now. And for the first time since arriving in Wallace, Lillian Harper felt truly at home. The following weeks brought a steady rhythm to their shared life. Jack continued to make improvements to Lillian's property, rebuilding the chicken coop that had been damaged in the storm, expanding her garden plot, and constructing a proper workbench for her sewing that would be easier on her back than the small table she'd been using. Lillian's ankle healed completely, allowing her to move freely about the cabin and grounds. With Jack's help, she made weekly trips to town to deliver completed orders and collect new ones. To her surprise, her business actually improved despite the bridge collapse. The townswomen seemed more eager than ever to commission her work, whether out of genuine need or as an excuse to inquire about her situation with the handsome cowboy who accompanied her. As May gave way to June, the weather grew warmer, and the countryside erupted in a riot of wildflowers. The bridge reconstruction progressed steadily, with the framework already spanning half the river. Soon, the temporary arrangement that had brought Jack into Lillian's life would come to its natural conclusion, a fact that neither of them discussed directly but which hung in the air between them during quiet evenings by the fire. It was on one such evening, exactly 3 weeks after the bridge collapse, that Jack finally broke the unspoken silence on the subject. "The sheriff says they'll finish the bridge by next Friday," he said, his voice carefully neutral as he whittled a small piece of wood by the firelight. "Barring any more storms, of course." Lillian's hands stilled on her embroidery. "That's good news," she replied, though her heart constricted at the implication. "The town will be relieved to have the direct route restored." Jack nodded, his eyes on his carving rather than her face. "It will make your business easier, too. No more long journeys around to Wilson's Ford." "Yes," Lillian agreed, struggling to keep her voice steady, "though I've come to enjoy those trips." Jack looked up then, his gray eyes meeting hers across the small space between them. "So have I." The simple acknowledgement opened the door to the conversation they'd been avoiding. Lillian set aside her embroidery, gathering her courage. "What will you do when the bridge is finished, Jack? Will you continue to Washington as planned?" Jack set down his whittling and the small knife he'd been using. In his hands was a delicately carved flower, a wild rose, Lillian realized, like those that grew along the riverbank. That depends, he said slowly, turning the wooden rose in his fingers. On whether there's sufficient reason for me to stay. Lillian's heart quickened. And what would constitute sufficient reason? Jack rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat, kneeling before her so they were at eye level. He offered her the carved rose, which she accepted with trembling fingers. "Lillian Harper," he began, his voice low and sincere, "when I pulled you from that collapsing bridge, I had no idea I was also saving myself. These weeks with you have shown me a kind of life I didn't know I was seeking, not just a piece of land to call my own, but a partner to share it with. A woman of intelligence, courage, and grace." Lillian could scarcely breathe as he took her free hand in both of his. "I know it's been only 3 weeks," Jack continued, "and you'd be right to think this is rushed or born of unusual circumstances. But I've lived enough years and met enough people to recognize what's rare and precious when I find it. And what's growing between us, Lillian, that's the rarest and most precious thing I've ever known." Tears pricked behind Lillian's eyes at the raw honesty in his voice. "Jack, I'm not asking for a firm decision tonight," he hurried on, squeezing her hand gently. "Only that you consider a different future than either of us planned. I still intend to claim that land in Washington, to build that ranch I've dreamed of, but I find I no longer want to do it alone." The implications of his words were clear. He was asking her to leave Wallace, to abandon the business she'd worked so hard to establish, to journey even farther from the world she'd known. It was a monumental decision, one that would irrevocably alter the course of her life. Yet as Lillian looked into Jack's earnest face, she realized with startling clarity that her decision had already been made, perhaps from the moment he'd grasped her hand above the raging waters. The past 3 weeks had merely confirmed what her heart had recognized instantly, that Jack Morgan was the partner she hadn't known she was seeking. "Ask me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Ask me properly, Jack." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a hope so profound it transformed his features. "Lillian Harper," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly visible on his face, "will you come with me to Washington? Will you build a life with me as my wife and partner in all things?" Lillian's smile bloomed like the wildflowers outside her door. "Yes, Jack Morgan, yes to all of it." The joy that spread across Jack's face was answer enough, but he didn't stop there. Rising slightly from his kneeling position, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with a gentleness that belied the strength she knew he possessed. Lillian responded in kind, her hands coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Jack rested his forehead against hers. "I don't have a ring," he admitted ruefully. "This wasn't exactly planned." Lillian laughed softly. "None of this was planned, Jack. That's what makes it perfect." He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face with tender fingers. "We'll need to make arrangements. There's the matter of your cabin, your business." "Details," Lillian dismissed with uncharacteristic lightness. "We'll sort them out together." Jack kissed her again, briefly but with unmistakable promise. "Together," he agreed. "I like the sound of that." The next morning they rode into town together, Lillian seated before Jack on his palomino rather than taking the buggy. The closeness was necessary, but also a statement they arrived as a couple, Jack's arms around Lillian as he handled the reins, her back pressed against his chest in a way that would leave no doubt in anyone's mind about the nature of their relationship. Their first stop was the small church at the edge of town, where they sought out Reverend Thomas to discuss their marriage plans. The elderly preacher received their news with genuine pleasure, but no real surprise. "I had a feeling this might be coming," he admitted with a twinkle in his eye. The Lord works in mysterious ways, bringing two souls together through such dramatic circumstances. Indeed he does, Reverend, Jack agreed, his hand finding Lillian's. We'd like to be married before we depart for Washington, if possible. Of course, the Reverend nodded. When did you have in mind? Jack and Lillian exchanged glances. The day after the bridge is completed, Lillian suggested. It seems fitting somehow. Next Saturday, then, Reverend Thomas confirmed. I'll make the necessary preparations. Will you be having guests? Lillian hesitated, suddenly aware that while she'd made acquaintances in Wallace, she had no real family or close friends to witness her marriage. Just a small ceremony, she began, not wanting to appear forlorn on what should be a joyous occasion. Nonsense, came a familiar voice from the church doorway. Mrs. Hollister stood there, basket in hand, her expression one of mingled triumph and satisfaction. The whole town will want to celebrate. Isn't that right, Reverend? Reverend Thomas chuckled. I believe you're right, Mrs. Hollister. Though I'm curious how you came to be here at this precise moment. The older woman had the good grace to look slightly abashed. I might have seen these two riding into town looking particularly cozy and guessed their destination. She turned to Lillian, her expression softening. My dear, you've become important to this community whether you realize it or not, and Mr. Morgan here saved one of our own. The town will want to share in your happiness. Touched by the sentiment, Lillian looked to Jack, who squeezed her hand in support. If you'd like that, Lillian, I'm agreeable. Then a proper wedding it shall be, Lillian decided, surprising herself with how right the decision felt. After years of independence and months of isolation, the idea of celebrating their union surrounded by the community that had slowly, quietly embraced her was unexpectedly appealing. Mrs. Hollister beamed. Wonderful. Now you'll need a proper dress, of course. And arrangements for the celebration after. Leave it all to me and the ladies of the church auxiliary. Mrs. Hollister, Lillian began, not wanting to impose. It would be our pleasure, dear, the older woman insisted. Consider it our wedding gift to you both. News of their engagement spread through Wallace with remarkable speed. By the time they'd finished their business at the church and made their way to the general store for supplies, it seemed everyone they passed offered congratulations and well wishes. The women of the town immediately began planning the wedding celebration, while the men clapped Jack on the back and offered good-natured advice about married life. Sheriff Davis found them as they were loading their purchases into their saddlebags. Heard the news, he said, shaking Jack's hand firmly. Couldn't be happier for you both. Wallace's loss will be Washington's gain. Thank you, Sheriff, Lillian replied warmly. We'll miss Wallace, but we're excited for our new beginning. The lawman nodded thoughtfully. Life's about new beginnings, isn't it? Speaking of which, I've been thinking about your cabin, Miss Harper. Once you're gone, the town could use it as a way station for travelers. We'd pay you a fair price, of course. The offer was unexpected but practical. Lillian had been wondering what to do with the small homestead she'd worked so hard to establish. That's an excellent solution, Sheriff. I accept, on behalf of myself and my future husband. The words future husband felt strange and wonderful on her tongue, and she caught Jack's pleased smile at hearing them. As they prepared to depart town, Mrs. Hollister hurried out of her store with a package wrapped in brown paper. Almost forgot, she said, handing it to Lillian. Some fabric I've been saving for a special occasion. White silk with pearl beading, perfect for a wedding dress if you ask me. Lillian unwrapped the corner of the package to reveal exquisite fabric that would indeed make a beautiful gown. Mrs. Hollister, this is too generous. Nonsense, the older woman interrupted. Consider it payment for all the beautiful work you've done for my Abigail. That child has never looked lovelier than in your creations." She patted Lillian's hand affectionately. "Besides, every bride deserves to feel beautiful on her wedding day." The ride back to the cabin was filled with excited planning and discussion of their future. Jack spoke of the land he intended to claim, describing the fertile valley nestled between rolling hills, the clear stream that ran through the property, the stands of timber that would provide lumber for their home. "It's wild country still," he cautioned, "rougher than Wallace in many ways." "Are you sure you're prepared for that kind of life, Lillian?" She considered the question seriously. "I left Boston society for a mining town in Idaho Territory, Jack. I think I've proven I can adapt to challenging circumstances." He chuckled, tightening his arm around her waist as they rode. "That you have. Still, building a ranch from nothing will be hard work for both of us. There will be times when we'll wonder if we made the right choice." "Perhaps," Lillian agreed, "but we'll face those times together, which makes all the difference." Jack pressed a kiss to her temple, his breath warm against her skin. "You're a remarkable woman, Lillian Harper, soon to be Lillian Morgan." The name change hadn't even occurred to her until that moment. "Lillian Morgan," she repeated, testing the sound of it. "I like that very much." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity as they prepared both for their wedding and their subsequent journey to Washington. Lillian worked tirelessly on her wedding dress, using the beautiful fabric Mrs. Hollister had provided to create a gown that was both elegant and practical for their frontier lifestyle. She also completed all outstanding sewing orders, determined to leave Wallace with her professional obligations fulfilled. Jack divided his time between continuing improvements on the cabin, which would now benefit the town rather than themselves, and making arrangements for their journey west. He purchased a sturdy wagon and a team of draft horses to pull it, as well as additional supplies they would need for the long trip to Olympia. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, planning their future together with a mixture of practical consideration and dreams. They decided to travel first to Spokane Falls, then follow the northern route across Washington Territory to Olympia, where Jack would finalize the land claim he had initiated months earlier. "We'll reach Olympia by late July if the weather holds," Jack explained as they studied a map spread out on the table. "That will give us time to build a basic shelter and plant some late crops before winter sets in. And next spring, we'll begin in earnest," Lillian added, excitement building as she envisioned their new home. "The ranch a proper garden, perhaps even some chickens and dairy cows to start." Jack nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It will be a lean first year, but by the second, we should be established enough to begin building the herd." "And a family?" Lillian asked softly, her hand finding his across the table. Jack's eyes met hers, warm with love and promise. "Nothing would make me happier than raising children with you, Lillian. Boys with your quick mind and girls with your courage. Or boys with your integrity and girls with your strength," she countered, squeezing his fingers. "But all with your eyes, I hope. I've always been partial to gray eyes." Jack laughed, bringing her hand to his lips. "I'm partial to everything about you, so I hope our children favor their mother." Such conversations filled their evenings with joy and anticipation, deepening the bond between them as they built not just plans but shared dreams for their future. The day before their wedding, the bridge was officially completed. The entire town turned out for a small ceremony marking the occasion, with the mayor cutting a ribbon stretched across the new structure. Lillian and Jack stood among the crowd, their hands clasped together as they watched. "It's strange to think that if the old bridge hadn't collapsed, we might never have met," Lillian mused as they walked across the new span afterward, the first people to use it after the official opening. Jack's arms slipped around her waist, drawing her close to his side. I'm not sure I believe that. Something tells me we were meant to find each other one way or another. Jack Morgan, are you becoming a romantic? Lillian teased, leaning into his embrace. Only where you're concerned, he replied with a smile that still made her heart skip. Besides, a man who's getting married tomorrow is entitled to a bit of romanticism. They paused in the middle of the bridge, looking down at the river that had nearly claimed Lillian's life and had instead given her a future she'd never dared imagine. The water flowed peacefully now, its surface glinting in the late afternoon sunlight, bearing no resemblance to the raging torrent of that stormy night. "Thank you," Lillian said suddenly, turning to face Jack. "For what?" he asked, his hands coming to rest at her waist. "For catching me," she replied simply. "Not just from the bridge, but every day since. For seeing me as I truly am and loving me anyway." Jack's expression softened, his eyes reflecting the depth of his feelings. "Loving you isn't a hardship, Lillian. It's the easiest, most natural thing I've ever done." Standing there on the bridge that symbolized both their past and their future, Jack lowered his head and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of lifelong commitment. Lillian responded in kind, her arms encircling his neck, her heart full to bursting with love for this man who had literally and figuratively swept her off her feet. Their wedding day dawned clear and bright, the June sun warming the small town of Wallace as it prepared for celebration. Tradition dictated that bride and groom shouldn't see each other before the ceremony, so Jack had spent the night in town while Lillian remained at the cabin, accompanied by Mrs. Hollister and her daughter Abigail, who insisted on helping the bride prepare. "You look absolutely beautiful, Mrs. Hollister declared as she secured the final pins in Lillian's upswept hair. "Mr. Morgan won't know what hit him." Lillian studied her reflection in the small mirror, hardly recognizing the radiant woman who looked back at her. The white silk dress with its delicate pearl beading was the finest garment she'd ever created, fitted perfectly to her slender frame and elegant in its simplicity. Mrs. Hollister had woven wildflowers into her hair columbine, and wild roses gathered fresh that morning, and the overall effect was of natural beauty rather than formal stiffness. "Thank you for everything, Mrs. Hollister," Lillian said, turning to embrace the older woman. "I never expected such kindness when I came to Wallace." Mrs. Hollister patted her back affectionately. "You brought something special to our town, dear. Your independence and determination have been an inspiration, particularly to the younger women." She nodded toward Abigail, who was arranging Lillian's small bouquet of wildflowers. "My Abigail has spoken of nothing but opening her own millinery shop someday, thanks to your example." The revelation touched Lillian deeply. She'd never considered that her presence in Wallace might influence others, especially the younger generation. It made leaving both harder and harder to say goodbye, but easier knowing she'd made a meaningful impact. Sheriff Davis arrived with the buggy at precisely 11 o'clock, resplendent in his Sunday best and beaming with paternal pride as he helped Lillian aboard. "Miss Harper, you're a vision," he declared. "It's my honor to escort you to the church." In the absence of her father, the sheriff had volunteered to give Lillian away, a gesture that had moved her to tears when he'd offered. Now, as they made the short journey to the small white church at the edge of town, Lillian felt a surge of gratitude for this community that had become, in its own way, her family. The church was filled to capacity when they arrived, every resident of Wallace apparently in attendance. As Sheriff Davis led her down the aisle, Lillian's eyes were drawn inevitably to Jack, who stood waiting by the altar. He had never looked more handsome than he did in that moment, dressed in a new black suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his frame. His dark hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, but it was his expression that truly took Lillian's breath away, a mixture of awe, tenderness, and profound love that made her feel like the most precious thing in the world. When she reached his side and Sheriff Davis placed her hand in Jack's, the connection between them was palpable, an electric current of shared feeling that made the rest of the world fade away. As they turned to face Reverend Thomas, their fingers intertwined, Lillian knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. They exchanged traditional vows, their voices clear and steady as they promised to love, honor, and cherish one another for all their days. When Jack slipped a simple gold band onto Lillian's finger purchased, she later learned, with funds from the sale of his pocket watch, tears of joy spilled onto her cheeks. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Thomas declared with evident satisfaction. "Mr. Morgan, you may kiss your bride." Jack needed no further encouragement. His hands gently cradled Lillian's face as he leaned down to seal their union with a kiss that was both tender and full of promise. The church erupted in cheers and applause, the community's approval of their match ringing in the rafters. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Lillian had experienced in Wallace or anywhere, for that matter. Tables laden with food and drink filled the town square. Musicians played lively tunes that had couples dancing in the street, and everyone, from the most respectable matrons to the roughest miners, joined in the festivities with genuine enthusiasm. "They really do care about you," Jack observed as they took a moment's respite from the dancing and well-wishing. "I don't think this is just an excuse for a party." Lillian nodded, watching as Mrs. Hollister directed a group of women in distributing slices of the magnificent wedding cake she had baked. "I've been so focused on maintaining my independence that I didn't realize connections were forming anyway. These people have become important to me without my even noticing." Jack squeezed her hand. "That's the way of it out here. Bonds form through shared hardship and mutual reliance, even for those who think they're keeping to themselves." The wisdom of his observation struck Lillian forcefully. She'd come west seeking independence, believing that self-reliance was the highest virtue. Yet her most profound happiness had come through connection, first with Jack, but also with this community that had embraced them both. As the sun began to set, casting long golden rays across the town square, the celebration showed no signs of abating. However, Jack and Lillian had planned to spend their wedding night at the cabin before beginning their journey west the following morning, and it was time to make their departure. Sheriff Davis called for attention, raising his glass in a final toast. "To Mr. and Mrs. Morgan, may your journey west bring you prosperity, and may you always remember that you have friends in Wallace, Idaho." "The Morgans," the crowd echoed, glasses raised high. Amid a shower of rice and flower petals, Jack helped Lillian into the buggy that would take them home, their home, if only for one more night. As they drove away, the sounds of celebration gradually fading behind them, Lillian leaned against her husband's shoulder, contentment washing over her in gentle waves. "Happy, Mrs. Morgan?" Jack asked, his arm secure around her. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied truthfully. "And you, Mr. Morgan?" He pressed a kiss to her temple, his voice low and intimate. "I've spent my life wandering, Lillian. Today I finally found my home." The simple declaration, spoken with such heartfelt sincerity, summed up everything Lillian felt as well. Home wasn't the small cabin they were returning to, nor was it the ranch they would build in Washington. Home was this man beside her, this love they had found in the most unexpected of circumstances. As they crossed the new bridge spanning the river where their story had begun, Lillian offered a silent prayer of gratitude for storms and broken bridges, and the mysterious ways of fate that had brought Jack Morgan into her life. 3 years later, Lillian Morgan stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching as Jack and their 2-year-old son, Thomas, examined a new foal in the nearby corral. The sight of them together, Jack's dark head bent close to Thomas's fair one, their matching gray eyes alight with wonder, filled her heart with a joy so profound it was almost painful. The journey from Wallace to Olympia had been arduous but uneventful, and they had arrived at their new home full of hopes and dreams for the future. The first year had indeed been lean, as Jack had predicted, but they had faced every challenge together, their bond strengthening through shared hardship and triumph. By the second year, the ranch was beginning to take shape. They had built a sturdy house with room for the family they hoped to have, cleared and fenced pastures for the growing herd, and established relationships with neighbors who, like them, were carving a life from the wilderness. Thomas had arrived that spring, a healthy, strong boy with his father's eyes and his mother's determined spirit. His birth, attended by a midwife from a neighboring homestead, had been the culmination of all they'd worked for, not just a home and livelihood, but a family to share it with. Now, as Lillian watched her husband lift their son to better see the wobbly-legged foal, her hand drifted to her abdomen, where their second child was just beginning to make its presence known. She hadn't told Jack yet, wanting to be certain before sharing the news, but the signs were unmistakable. By winter, their family would grow again. "Mama, look," Thomas called, his high voice carrying across the yard. "Baby horse." Lillian smiled and waved, her heart swelling with love for her little family. "I see, sweetheart. Is he friendly?" Jack swung Thomas onto his shoulders, the boy's delighted giggles floating on the afternoon air as they approached the porch. "Friendly but shy," Jack explained, his eyes meeting Lillian's with the same warmth that still made her pulse quicken after 3 years of marriage. "Like his mama." "Then I'm sure he'll grow up to be as magnificent as his father," Lillian replied, reaching up to ruffle Thomas's hair as Jack climbed the porch steps. Jack set Thomas down, and the boy immediately ran to the wooden toys scattered near Lillian's rocking chair, carved animals that Jack had made during the long winter evenings, each one a testament to his love for his son. "How are you feeling today?" Jack asked, his perceptive gaze taking in the slight pallor of Lillian's complexion. "You seemed tired at breakfast." Lillian hesitated, then decided the moment was right. "I have something to tell you," she said softly, taking his hand and placing it gently on her still flat abdomen. "We're going to have another baby, Jack, come winter." Joy bloomed across Jack's face, followed swiftly by concern. "Are you certain it's so soon after Thomas?" "I'm certain," Lillian assured him, "and I'm well, truly, just a bit more tired than usual." Jack pulled her into his arms, his embrace gentle but secure. "Another baby," he murmured against her hair. "Our family is growing just as we hoped." "Just as we planned," Lillian corrected with a smile, leaning back to look into his beloved face. "You always said we'd need plenty of hands to run this ranch properly." Jack laughed, the sound still her favorite melody after all this time. "I was thinking more of hiring help in a few years, but I suppose growing our own ranch hands works too." They stood together on the porch of the home they'd built, watching their son play in the late afternoon sunshine, the future stretching before them full of promise and possibility. The hardships they'd endured, the collapsed bridge, the difficult journey west, the lean first years on the ranch had only strengthened their bond, tempering their love like steel and fire. "You ever regret it?" Jack asked suddenly, his arm still around her waist. "Leaving Wallace, your business. The life you built there." Lillian considered the question seriously, as she did all things. "No," she answered truthfully. "I miss the people sometimes, Mrs. Hollister and Abigail, Sheriff Davis, the others who were so kind to us. But this life we've created together, Jack, it's more than I ever dreamed possible." She turned in his arms to face him fully, her hands coming up to frame his weather-bronzed face. "That night on the bridge when you caught me, you didn't just save my life. You gave me a new one, a better one." Jack's eyes, those remarkable gray eyes that had captured her heart from the first, softened with emotion. "We saved each other, Lillian, and we keep doing it every day." As the sun began its descent toward the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Jack lowered his head and kissed his wife with the same tenderness and passion that had marked their first kiss. Lillian responded in kind, her heart full of gratitude for the storm that had brought this remarkable man into her life, and the love that had transformed them both. Their story had begun with a collapsed bridge and a desperate grasp in darkness. It continued now in the home they'd built together, in the child playing at their feet and the one growing beneath Lillian's heart, in the thousand small moments of daily life shared in love and partnership. It wasn't the life either of them had planned, but as Jack often said, the best journeys were the ones you couldn't map in advance. And this journey, their journey, was only just beginning.